again and how to promote homeownership. So I'd actually like to start with Christy, because you're down there in the neighborhoods. You're talking to the people who perhaps would like to be homeowners. In your opinion, how important to a person's health, wealth, and future is being a homeowner?
Well, thank you, Diana, and thank you to HUD for having us all here, especially Secretary Carson and the Office of Homeownership Counseling. As a HUD-approved housing counseling agency, I just need to thank the leadership of Sarah Drake, who leads that office, as well as the Office of PDR. So when we think about homeownership, we've obviously learned a lot from the foreclosure crisis. The Center for New York City Neighborhoods mission is to promote and protect affordable homeownership. So a lot of the work that we do is helping homeowners keep their homes. But when we look at what people's options are relative to other housing availability, homeownership is a really important strategy, and it's also an important strategy for building wealth. So while it's not the only solution, we think it's a really critical solution. It's also really important as we're looking at some really significant gaps in asset building among different racial groups. So it's not the only solution, but it's a really critical solution, and it's one that we fight for every day because we see the benefits that it can have. In a lot of markets, owning a property can have a lower housing cost than renting. It's more stable. You have the ability to invest in your community over the long term. And often homeowners provide lower market rents than investor owners. So we think homeownership is a critical strategy. We think we can do it better. We can learn from what we went through with the foreclosure crisis. We can be smart about how we counsel homeowners as they're looking to buy, and we can think really strategically about how to support homeowners over the life of the loan. So it's a great strategy. It's not the only strategy, but we always say that coming out of the crisis, we can't reject an entire class of assets for building communities and building family wealth.
And to that end, what would you like to see from government today? Because from the current government, we hear a lot about public-private partnerships, and I just actually interviewed the secretary who said, government money should be seed money. But really it needs to be public-private partnerships because that's where the wealth for housing comes from, is the private sector. Do you agree with that?
Well, the typical homeownership, the typical family buying a home is a public-private enterprise, right? You've got homeowners putting up their own equity. A lot of times we want people to be working with housing counselors, which are funded by government often. We think it's really important that there be sort of a triple bottom line, right? Benefit for the homeowner, benefit for the community, the neighborhood, and benefit for the tax base. So we think everybody should be invested. And often it can be a short-term investment. Housing counseling is a very cost-effective way to invest in long-term housing outcomes. Both on the front end and on the stabilization side as well. So I think by nature of what we've been doing for many years, it is a public-private partnership. I don't think it's the type of investment where, from a budgetary perspective, you couldn't put $1 in next year and then not have it in the following year. All of the colleagues who work in this field are fighting, fiercely to preserve CDBG funding, home funding, SHOP funding in the HUD budget, because these flexible sources of funding are critical for maintaining the boots on the ground that really help people do this work. So I think that we can call it a public-private partnership. The center was started through a partnership of philanthropy, government, and corporations. But at the end of the day, we need government in there as well over the long term. It can't just be in there on day one.
Well, and you talk about counseling, but I would, just because I'm in the finance background,
Sure.
In financing the mortgages that we get to Americans, and I'm going to kick it over in that segue over to Joel, we're looking at GSE reform. Fannie and Freddie have been in conservatorship way too long. There have been many, many proposals out there. We talk about bringing private sector back into the mortgage market to help people get access to mortgage credit, which is how they become homeowners. But there does need to be a government backstop. Some of the plans don't have that. Most of them do. Where do you see GSE reform going this year? And with so much out there in the administration this year, do you think that it's really going to happen this year?
Right. Thanks. So again, thanks for having me, and really appreciate being here with my fellow colleagues too. The way we think about GSE reform, there are sort of three main pillars, if you will. So the importance of protecting the taxpayers. So, just having that, having the backstop. but also having the private funds available to keep the markets running. On that note, in order to attract private investors, you do need a rate of return for them. So in that sense, then you need regulatory oversight, you need supervision, and just sort of for that market to really work. And then last but obviously not least, we have the access to credit and the cost to borrowers. So third piece of that, and it's really sort of balancing those three, right? So for the first two, they all sort of spill into it's impacting what borrowers end up sort of paying, sort of the all-in cost of the loan, if you will. So the biggest thing is really just sort of balancing those three factors and moving that forward. We have a paper out there now. You probably covered that too, and so the details are there, but those three are the most important things.
But credit
factors.
is really important,
right.
Especially for the youngest homeowners. And I would encourage you all to jump in and argue with each other if you would like, because that's what makes it
right.
fun for them, right? We talk a lot about millennials not being able to get into the housing market, younger people, because they have a lack of credit. They don't have the scores. They don't have the money for the down payment. They don't have the credit history. And today, supposedly, the mortgage market is so much stricter, although some would argue that it's not quite as strict as it was 5 years ago, even that we're starting to see more programs. But when it comes to home ownership, and I know you have done a lot of work in this area, John, there's this balance of people saying, well, millennials don't really want to own homes anymore. They want to be flexible. They saw what happened in their parents' generation. They see renting as just fine. There's no stigma attached to it at all. And then others say, well, once they age into that section of, into that area of being married and having kids and wanting the house in the suburbs, that's when they're going to buy homes. But we also have more than 1 million new single-family rental homes, thanks to the crisis, out in America. So if you want to live in a great school district out in the burbs and raise your family with a backyard, you can also rent. It's not all apartment buildings. What do you see as the reason millennials have not jumped in?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I should start also by repeating the thanks to HUD for including me in this conversation. The heart of that question is, has something fundamentally changed in the way that young people think about homeownership? And the best answer I can give you based on evidence is that we don't have a consistent time series over time to answer that conclusively. But the evidence that we do have suggests that there is, I haven't seen anything to suggest that there is. And so I want to point to a couple of pieces of evidence and then tie back to the first question about reasons for homeownership. So the first is, in survey data, if we ask households, do you either own a home today or aspire to own one in the future or expect to own one in the future? About 83% of people expect to own a home at some point in the future. That's actually consistent across every age group. It's the highest. It's about 90% among those younger than age 30. That doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't some longer-term shift away, but it doesn't tell a cohesive story about millennials turning their backs on home ownership. The second is that if we ask young people about what are the biggest barriers to home ownership, we're not getting answers about, well, I've run the math and I think that the financial return is greater by putting the money in my IRA or my 401k. What we get are the economic factors. We get responses about building credit history, about saving for a down payment and closing costs, about having sufficient income. And the standard or sort of the economic components of being able to afford a home. And so in looking at millennials, at least in the data I've seen, there's a consistent trend that there is some delay in household formation, there is some delay in marriage and childbirth, but that points to a delay in entry to homeownership and not a reduction in the number of households that eventually attain homeownership. And so in trying to think about the struggles that are facing millennials today and how to potentially broaden access to homeownership, I think it comes back to those economic factors. I'll leave it.
And it also comes back to those that are out in the market, can't find what they want to buy. We keep talking about millennials who are on the older side and 35 years old, perhaps at the leading edge, that they're getting out into the market now, and they're finding the hardest time finding a home, finding an affordable home to buy. It's not that they don't have the credit or the down payment, but there's just nothing out there. And the home builders are not catering to that starter entry-level demographic. And I know every time I go to the Realtor conference, press conference every month, and we hear about home sales, which have been falling. The numbers have been weak the last 2 months, and Lawrence says over and over again, there's just not enough inventory out there, especially on the lower end. We see the drops in the under $100,000 level. How do we get millennials? How do real estate agents guide millennials into this market, into home ownership, when the builders are not catering to them?
Well, I'm glad that HUD is holding this conference, and for Secretary Carson to recognize the importance of the home ownership. And as John mentioned, the aspiration for ownership is there. 80%, close to 90% wanting to own a property at some point. And housing market 10 years ago, the problem was lack of buyers. Today, the home sales are falling not due to lack of buyers, but just because lack of supply that is available on the marketplace. So that is the constraint that's holding back. And as Secretary Carson has mentioned, there are many metrics that shows that housing market is on a better footing, recovering, going upward. But one thing that is not working right is that home ownership rate being at essentially 50-year low. So we have the aspiration to become owners remaining very high, yet people who own to own, that dream is not being realized. Now, one of the things that we have constantly mentioned from the Realtors Association perspective is the lack of inventory, and consequently, as a result, the prices are rising too fast and hurting affordability. Just to illustrate, over the past 5 years, home values have risen by 40%, while wages have risen only by 10%. 4-to-1 ratio. One cannot have this mismatch continuing. So we have a situation where housing market is recovering, but somehow it just does not feel right. And that not feeling right is that home ownership rate is at a 50-year low.
Well, then how can we all sit here and argue that home ownership builds wealth? I mean, that was the very first thing you said, was that we need to get into home ownership in order to build wealth. That's what the middle class does. But if home prices are so far out of whack and we're going to over-leverage ourselves to get into a home, then how are we going to build wealth?
Well, I think we need new tools, right? So I think in many cases we're trying to solve 2017 problems with 1987 tools, right? Both on the marketing side, on the lending side, and on the assistance side. So, for example, in New York City, we recently changed our down payment assistance program to go from $15,000, which, if you know the prices in New York City, is not sufficient, up to $25,000, and which makes a big difference. We increased the AMI level as well, the area median income requirement. So it was pegged to 80% of AMI, which was, again, really difficult to make it match prices in the area. And with that increase, we saw a lot more folks come in and were able to actually successfully complete a purchase. So better down payment assistance tools that match market needs that really can help first-time homebuyers get in. You can structure down payment assistance to have it recycle so that it's not so that it's an investment that pays back the public investment over time. I think we also need to look at the mortgage market as well to make sure that we're allowing folks to buy the product that is out there in a responsible way. We hear about a lot of communities, not just in New York, but across the country, where there may be some deferred maintenance in properties coming through the many years of the foreclosure crisis, and conservative lenders may not want to lend on a property that may have some repairs that are needed. So the state of New York is actually putting out a mortgage product through their Sunny May program that comes with some repair money as well as a reduced mortgage rate targeted at certain communities where they're trying to get folks to move and invest. So I know that in areas like Detroit, that's really important. You need to be able to both fix up the properties where there may not be value there, and that's where we need a little bit more flexibility from the lender. So we need better tools on the government side, and we also need, I think, flexibility on the lending side.
But back to the fundamental question of, does home ownership build wealth? I mean, in your surveys, when you see that there is this aspiration to own, is the aspiration to own because it's a status thing, because it's a stability thing, or because people really think, I'm going to make a whole lot of money in the housing market?
Yeah, so all of the above. And that's just to put my academic hat on for a second. I'll say it depends, or all of the above. But I want to touch on each of those. So one is the prospects for homeownership to build wealth. So our estimates, we take the PSID sampling of people who in 1999 were either owners or renters. Those who stayed renters through 2013 on average saw a median change in their net wealth of $0. Their net wealth was around $2,000 during that entire period. Those who were renters, became owners, sustained homeownership, saw their median net wealth increase by $85,000 from under $10,000 to about $99,000.